My name is Rachel Doyle, and for 6 years, I lived a double life inside my own family. On the surface, I was the dutiful daughter who showed up for holidays, smiled through dinners, and never said a cross word to my father's new wife. Underneath that surface, I was quietly protecting $40 million from a woman I never trusted for a single day of the time I knew her. My mother, Eleanor, died when I was 24. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed too late to matter, gone in 11 brutal months that taught me more about grief than I ever wanted to know. My father, James, was destroyed by it in a way I didn't fully understand until years later. Not because he stopped functioning, but because he functioned too well, too fast, in a way that looks like recovery but was actually something closer to running. 2 years after my mother's funeral, he met Vanessa Cole at a charity gala. She was 38. He was 61. I remember doing that math in my head the first time he mentioned her name over dinner, and I remember deciding, before I'd even met her, to give her a fair chance anyway. Because my father deserved happiness and I wasn't going to be the daughter who poisoned it out of spite. I gave her that fair chance for almost a year. It didn't survive contact with reality. Vanessa was polished in a way that read as warmth until you paid close attention. She complimented my job, my apartment, my independence, always with a faint undertone that suggested she found it slightly pitiable. Rather than admirable, she redecorated my mother's house. My father's house, technically, but it had been my mother's in every way that mattered within 4 months of moving in. Replacing photographs, repainting rooms my mother had chosen colors for, as if she were erasing a competitor rather than making a home. My father didn't see it. Grief had made him grateful in a way that blinded him to things he would have noticed a decade earlier. Vanessa gave him attention, energy, a version of vitality he'd thought he'd lost along with my mother, and in exchange, he gave her something. I don't think he ever fully realized he was giving away unquestioned trust. I watched her operate for years before I understood what I was actually looking at. She wasn't cruel, not in any way you could point to directly. She was patient. She built her position. In our family, the way a careful investor builds a portfolio, small, deniable moves spread out over years, each one individually reasonable, collectively transformative. She got herself added to accounts for convenience. During a hospital stay of my father's in year 2, she encouraged him, gently, to update his will now that circumstances have changed, meaning her. In year 3, she slowly inserted herself into every financial conversation my father and I used to have privately, until I couldn't ask him about anything without her present, offering opinions on matters that had nothing to do with her. I didn't have proof of anything malicious. I had a pattern and a feeling in my gut that had been right about people before, and a promise I'd made to myself the day I watched her repaint my mother's favorite room a shade of gray she called modern neutral. I promised myself that whatever was mine, whatever came from my mother's side of the family, whatever my grandfather had built, would never end up in Vanessa Cole's hands. Not because I was greedy, because I didn't trust her with anything my mother had touched. Some nights, in those early years, I'd sit alone in my apartment holding one of the few things I'd kept of my mother's, a small enamel pin shaped like a sparrow she used to wear on her coat every winter, and I'd just cry, quietly, for a woman I still reached for out of habit some mornings before remembering she was gone. Grief doesn't announce itself politely. It just shows up in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, holding a pin shaped like a bird, and reminds you that some losses don't get smaller. They just get quieter. My grandfather, Arthur Whitmore, built a shipping logistics company from a single truck in 1968 into a regional operation worth just over $110 million. By the time he sold his controlling stake, he was private, suspicious of showmanship. He structured his estate the way he'd structured his business, quietly, in layers, most of it invisible until you needed it. He told me about my trust himself, 18 months before he died, in his study with the door closed. Your mother would want you protected, he said. Not supported, protected. There's a difference he didn't explain further. I didn't fully understand what he meant until years later. I remember, before he said it, glancing at the photograph on his desk, my mother at 19, laughing at something out of frame, taken the summer before she met my father. He caught me looking. She'd have hated watching you become cautious, he said quietly. But I think she'd have understood why you needed to. That was the only time either of us said my mother's name out loud that afternoon. We didn't need to say it again. It was in every sentence he spoke after that. The trust was structured through a private holding entity, managed by an independent trustee with no connection to my father's second marriage. Distributions were discretionary. The principal sat protected, filed under a corporate name that bore no resemblance to Whitmore, Doyle, or Cole. My father knew only the vaguest outline, that his father-in-law had set something up for me. He never knew the number. Vanessa didn't know it existed at all. I decided, quietly, in the months after my grandfather's funeral, to keep it that way. It wasn't about deceiving my father. If he'd asked me directly, I would have told him something close to the truth. But he never asked, because Vanessa had slowly become the filter every financial conversation in our family passed through, and I wasn't handing a single detail of my mother's legacy to a woman I'd watched annex my father's. Trust one convenient signature at a time. For 6 years I lived modestly. Normal salary. Normal apartment. Nothing that would raise a question. Underneath that surface, the trust grew quietly, disciplined, walled off completely from a family dynamic. I no longer fully trusted my father's health began declining seriously. Around year 5 of his marriage to Vanessa, nothing dramatic, fatigue, cardiac scare that turned out manageable, but I watched, with growing unease, how quickly Vanessa moved to formalize control during every one of those health scares. After the cardiac incident, she pushed gently but persistently for power of attorney just in case. He agreed almost immediately, grateful for someone managing the logistics of his fear. I raised a concern once, carefully, suggesting I be named alongside her. Vanessa smiled at me across a hospital cafeteria table. James and I have already discussed it, sweetheart. I think it's best we keep things simple. Simple meant simple for her. There's a moment from that same hospital stay I still think about more than almost anything else from those years. Vanessa had gone to find coffee, and for 10 minutes it was just my father and me. Him still groggy from the procedure, reaching for my hand the way he used to when I was small enough to need help crossing streets. Your mother used to hold my hand exactly like this in hospital waiting rooms, he said, half to himself. I always thought she was the strong one. I think I got that backwards. I think it was always you two who were strong. I just borrowed it. I didn't say anything. I just held his hand until Vanessa came back with the coffee, and something in me quietly decided, in that 10 minutes, that whatever else happened, I was going to make sure nobody ever spent this family's love as leverage against the parts of it that couldn't defend themselves anymore. Over the following year, account after account quietly reorganized without my visibility. Estate planning meetings happened without me. Decisions finalized before I even learned they'd occurred. Vanessa cultivated relationships with my father's advisor and attorney that increasingly excluded me from conversations I'd once been part of. None of it alone was illegal. What unsettled me was the pattern. Underneath every adjustment, moving resources and authority toward Vanessa and away from me, one reasonable step at a time, while my father's health made him less and less able to notice. I didn't confront her. Direct confrontation with Vanessa never produced honesty, only a more sophisticated performance of innocence. Instead, I documented everything, every account change, every email, and re-advisor's name that hadn't been in our lives 5 years earlier. I consulted an estate attorney of my own, someone with no connection to Vanessa or my father's team. It's not enough to act on yet, she told me, but it's enough to prepare for. I understood, with growing clarity, that whatever came next in my family, I needed to be ready for a fight. I hadn't started, but could plainly see coming. My father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 11 months before he died. The diagnosis itself was devastating enough, but what followed those 11 months revealed more about Vanessa's true character than the previous 6 years combined. She was, to be fair, genuinely present during his illness in the ways that were visible. She sat with him during chemotherapy, managed his medication schedule, fielded calls from concerned relatives with what looked, from the outside, like real devotion. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. Grief is rarely simple. And I don't believe Vanessa was performing every single moment of that year. I think some of it was real, but underneath the visible devotion, something else was happening that I only fully understood in retrospect. 3 months into his treatment, my father's estate attorney called me directly, a break from the pattern of exclusion I'd grown used to, done quietly, I later learned, because the attorney himself had grown uneasy about requests he was fielding from Vanessa without my father's direct, unambiguous instruction. I want to be careful how I say this, he told me, but I've received several requests over the past few weeks to adjust beneficiary designations and account structures described to me as coming from your father's wishes, communicated through Vanessa on his behalf. During periods when I understand he's been heavily medicated and not always fully lucid, I haven't acted on any of them without direct confirmation from him personally. But I wanted you to be aware. I sat with that information for a long time before deciding what to do with it. I visited my father more frequently after that call, timing my visits when I could manage it around his more lucid mornings rather than his medicated afternoons. I asked him directly, gently, about his wishes for his estate, not to manipulate him, but because I genuinely needed to understand what he actually wanted, independent of whatever was being relayed to his attorney through an intermediary. What I learned troubled me. My father, in his clearer moments, expressed wishes that didn't always match what his Dalish ORNEY had described being requested on his behalf. He wanted the house to eventually pass to me when Vanessa doesn't need it anymore, a phrase that suggested some form of life estate rather than outright ownership transfer. He wanted specific personal items of my mother's jewelry and photographs Vanessa hadn't yet redecorated out of the house, explicitly preserved for me. He never, in any conversation I had directly with him, expressed a wish to disinherit me or restructure our relationship in the ways some of the attorney's fielded requests seemed to suggest. I began recording our conversations with his knowledge and consent, specifically because I could see, with growing dread, exactly where things might be heading after he was gone. It felt like a betrayal of the trust in a marriage-adjacent family dynamic to prepare so carefully for conflict with a woman who was, in that same period, sitting beside my father's hospital bed every single day. But I'd learned over 6 years that Vanessa's presence and Vanessa's intentions were not always the same thing. And I wasn't willing to bet my mother's legacy or my father's actual wishes on the assumption that they were. My father died on a Tuesday morning in March, 11 months after his diagnosis, with both Vanessa and me in the room. The night before, in one of his last clear moments, he squeezed my hand and just said, "Rach, my girl," that was it. No speech, no goodbye dressed up as anything bigger than it was. I said, "I'm right here, Dad," and he nodded like that was enough, and it was. Whatever complicated dynamics existed underneath the surface of our family, I want to be honest that his death itself was not a moment of conflict. It was simply loss, the kind that it doesn't care about inheritance, disputes, or hidden trusts, or years of careful documentation. I grieved him fully, completely, the same way I'd grieved my mother 9 years earlier. The conflict came later. It always does. The will reading happened 3 weeks after the funeral, in the office of my father's longtime estate attorney, Mr. Halloran, the same man who'd called me directly during my father's treatment. Vanessa arrived in black, composed, seated across the table from me with an expression I'd come to recognize over 6 years as her particular blend of grief and calculation, impossible to fully separate from each other. The will itself was, in most respects, exactly what my father had described to me in his clearer moments. The house passed into a life estate arrangement, allowing Vanessa to remain there for her lifetime or until she chose to leave, with the property ultimately passing to me. Specific personal items, my mother's jewelry, family photographs, a collection of letters were explicitly designated to me by name. The remainder of my father's personal estate, roughly $6 million, in liquid assets and investments accumulated over his lifetime, split according to a formula that gave Vanessa the majority as his surviving spouse, with a smaller but still substantial distribution to me. I watched Vanessa's expression through the reading, and I could see, even through her composure, a flicker of something like satisfaction settling into place. The sense, I think, of a plan finally arriving at its intended destination after 6 patient years of positioning. The will reading happened 3 weeks after the funeral, in the office of my father's longtime estate attorney, Mr. Halloran, the same man who'd called me directly during my father's treatment. Vanessa arrived in black, composed, seated across the table from me with an expression I'd come to recognize over 6 years as her particular blend of grief and calculation, impossible to fully separate from each other. The will itself was, in most respects, exactly what my father had described to me in his clearer moments. The house passed into a life estate arrangement, allowing Vanessa to remain there for her lifetime or until she chose to leave, with the property ultimately passing to me. Specific personal items, my mother's jewelry, family photographs, a collection of letters were explicitly designated to me by name. The remainder of my father's personal estate, roughly $6 million, in liquid assets and investments accumulated over his lifetime, split according to a formula that gave Vanessa the majority as his surviving spouse, with a smaller but still substantial distribution to me. I watched Vanessa's expression through the reading, and I could see, even through her composure, a flicker of something like satisfaction settling into place. The sense, I think, of a plan finally arriving at its intended destination after 6 patient years of positioning. What she didn't know, and what Mr. Halloran had no reason to mention because it existed entirely outside my father's estate, was that none of what had just been, read aloud, represented anything close to the full picture of what I actually had. She found out 4 months later, entirely by accident, the trust my grandfather established for me had, over 11 years of professional management, grown from its original $40 million funding to just over $52 million through a combination of conservative investment growth and the deliberate, disciplined reinvestment I'd insisted on rather than drawing distribution I didn't need. I'd continued living modestly throughout this entire period, specifically to avoid any lifestyle changes that might raise questions I wasn't prepared to answer. The exposure came through a mutual acquaintance, a financial advisor at a firm Vanessa had begun using after my father's death, who happened to have some peripheral knowledge of trust structures managed by the same larger financial institution that oversaw my grandfather's trust. In a conversation that was almost certainly meant to be harmless small talk about the region's wealthy families, this advisor mentioned in passing a substantial Whitmore family trust he'd heard referenced in professional circles, one that, based on the structure and history he described, could only have been mine. Vanessa called me 11 days later, her voice carrying a tightness I'd rarely heard from her in 6 years of careful composure. "We need to talk," she said, "about a trust. $40 million I apparently knew nothing about. Okay, I said, that's it? Okay. What do you want me to say, Vanessa? I didn't deny it. There was no point, and frankly, some part of me, the part that had spent 6 years being careful, quiet and patient, felt an almost unfamiliar relief at the idea of finally being direct with her. "That trust has nothing to do with you," I said. "It was established by my grandfather, funded by my mother's side of the family, structured over a decade before you and my father ever met. It's not part of his estate. It was never part of his estate. There's nothing to discuss." "He was my husband," she said. "We built a life together. I think I have a right to understand the full financial picture of the family I was part of." "You have a right to what's in his will," I said. "You received exactly that. This isn't his money. It was never his money. It's mine, from my mother's family, and it has been for 11 years. My voice shook a little on the word mother. I hated that it did. I hadn't meant to let her hear anything that sounded like vulnerability. But 11 years of protecting something in my mother's memory finally being spoken out loud to the one person I'd hidden it from hit harder than I expected it to. She didn't respond well to that. The composed warmth I'd watched her perform for 6 years finally, fully dropped away. And what replaced it was something colder, more direct, more honest than anything I'd heard from her in the entire time I'd known her. "We'll see about that," she said and hung up. 3 weeks later, a lawyer's letter arrived at my apartment. Vanessa's attorney's letter alleged, in careful legal language, that the trust I'd inherited from my grandfather should be considered, at least in part, marital property subject to some form of equitable claim and argument, built on the premise that my father's financial support and guidance over the years of his marriage to Vanessa had somehow contributed to the trust's growth and management, and that Vanessa, as his surviving spouse, deserved consideration of that contribution. It was, as my own attorney told me within minutes of reading it, an extraordinarily weak legal argument, built more on aggression and financial pressure than genuine legal merit. My grandfather's trust predated my father's marriage to Vanessa by roughly 6 years. It had never been commingled with marital assets. It had been managed entirely independently by a trustee with no connection to either my father or Vanessa, using funds that originated entirely from my mother's family before Vanessa had ever entered any of our lives. But weak legal arguments can still cause real damage if you don't fight them properly, and Vanessa, it turned out, wasn't interested in a quick, quiet resolution. She wanted a public fight. She showed up 3 weeks after the initial letter, at my apartment door, with her attorney standing beside her, a tall, sharply dressed man named Preston Marsh who specialized, I would later learn, in exactly this kind of aggressive estate litigation, the sort designed to pressure settlements out of grieving, families who preferred avoiding the expense and exposure of a courtroom fight. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way, Rachel," Vanessa said, standing in my doorway with an expression that had finally, completely shed every trace of the warmth she performed for 6 years. "Preston believes we have a very strong case for at least partial claim on that trust, given your father's role advising you on its management over the years." "That's a lie and you know it," I said. "Careful," Preston said. "No," I said. "You be careful. You're standing in my doorway with a made-up story about a man who's been dead 4 months. That claim was, as it happened, an outright fabrication. My father had never advised me on the trust's management. He'd barely known it existed. But I understood, standing in that doorway, that Vanessa wasn't actually building a legal case designed to win on the merits. She was building a pressure campaign, betting that the threat of a prolonged, expensive, publicly messy legal fight would push me toward a settlement simply to make the exposure go away. I told her calmly that I'd have my attorney respond formally, and closed the door. Then I made a decision that, looking back, was probably the single most important choice of the entire 6-year conflict. I decided not to settle, not to negotiate quietly, and not to let Vanessa's aggression dictate the terms of how this ended. I decided to fight it, completely, in the open. My attorney, Diane Reyes, assembled a defense on 3 pillars. First, The timeline. Original trust documents. Dated and notarized 6 years before my father even met Vanessa. No version of events existed in which he could claim contribution to something that predated her by half a decade. Second, independence of management. 11 years of trustee records showing the trust had been run entirely by an independent fiduciary. No relationship to my father. An investment strategy developed without his input at all. Every claim about his guidance collapsed against paperwork that proved he'd had no access to it, ever. Third, and this was the pillar that changed everything, Vanessa's own conduct during my father's illness. Diane's investigators found exactly what Mr. Halloran had warned me about months earlier, a series of attempted account and beneficiary changes submitted during my father's chemotherapy. Several time to periods of documented sedation, all routed through Vanessa's direct communication with financial institutions. Then they found something worse, a pattern of emails between Vanessa and Preston Marsh, dating back nearly 4 months before my father's death while he was still alive. Strategy discussions, estate restructuring language, and in one message, sent on a Tuesday afternoon while my father slept 2 floors above her home office. A single damning line, a direct reference to the Whitmore Trust situation she'd known, or at minimum suspected, long before her supposed accidental discovery 4 months after the will reading. The entire narrative of innocence collapsed the moment that email surfaced. Vanessa's single quotes deposition took place in a conference room downtown, 5 months after her attorney's first letter arrived at my apartment. I attended, seated beside Diane, watching a woman I'd spent 6 years carefully observing finally run out of composure to perform with. Diane walked her through the timeline methodically, patiently, laying each piece of evidence in front of her one at a time. Watching Vanessa's answers grow increasingly evasive as the contradictions accumulated. "Mrs. Doyle," Diane said, using my father's last name deliberately, watching Vanessa's jaw tighten at the reminder that she'd taken it too. "Can you explain this email? Dated 4 months before your husband's death, in which you discuss the Whitmore Trust situation with attorney Preston Marsh?" Vanessa's attorney objected, predictably, on grounds that had no real bearing on the actual question. The objection was noted, and Vanessa was still required to answer. "I don't recall the specific context of that email," Vanessa said, a phrase I watched her repeat in various forms, no fewer than 14 times over the following 3 hours, in response to nearly every piece of documentation that contradicted her narrative of innocent recent discovery. Diane pressed further, methodically walking through the attempted account changes during my father's medicated periods, the pattern of exclusion I'd experienced over 6 years, the timeline that made clear Vanessa had been building toward this legal challenge for months before she'd ever claimed to accidentally learn about the trust's existence. But the deposition wasn't finished. Diane had saved the last document for the end, on purpose, the way a good attorney saves the thing that changes the entire room. "Mrs. Doyle," Diane said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table, "can you tell us the name Gerald Voice?" I watched something in Vanessa's face go still in a way I hadn't seen in 6 years of watching her carefully manage every expression. Gerald Voss, it turned out, had been Vanessa's husband before my father, a fact she had never once mentioned in 6 years, a fact my father, as far as I knew, had never known at all. Voss had been a commercial real estate developer worth an estimated $18 million, 22 years older than Vanessa, who died 4 years into their marriage of a cardiac event his own family had, at the time, quietly questioned but never formally pursued. Diane's investigators had found a probate dispute from that estate, sealed, mostly, but not sealed enough, in which Voss's adult children had alleged, unsuccessfully, that Vanessa had systematically restructured beneficiary designations and account access during the final 18 months of his declining health almost identically to the pattern we'd just spent 5 months documenting with my own father. The case had gone nowhere at the time. No criminal charges. No successful civil claim. Just a quiet settlement, a confidentiality agreement, and a woman who'd walked away with roughly $6 million and, apparently, a playbook she'd used again 9 years later on my father. "I'd like the record to reflect," Diane said into the silence that followed, "that this is not the first marriage in which Mrs. Doyle has been accused, by a decedent's own family, of financially isolating a dying spouse during his final months." Preston Marsh didn't object. I think in that moment, even he understood there was nothing left to object to. Vanessa's composure didn't just crack. It came apart completely in front of everyone in that room, in a way I'd waited 6 years to see and took no satisfaction in watching. Once it actually happened, she didn't cry. She simply went very quiet, staring at a probate filing from a marriage she'd clearly hoped had stayed buried, and said nothing at all for almost a full minute. By the time the deposition ended, Vanessa's case had gone from legally weak to functionally indefensible. And something more than that, it had gone from a woman contesting a trust to a woman whose entire pattern of behavior across 2 marriages was now sitting on the record in black and white. Diane told me afterward, quietly, in the elevator down, that she doubted Preston Marsh would recommend proceeding to trial once he'd had time to fully absorb what had just happened in that room. She was right. 3 weeks after the deposition, Preston Marsh contacted Diane requesting a settlement conference. What he proposed initially was a face-saving arrangement that would allow Vanessa to withdraw her claim quietly, without a formal admission of wrongdoing, in exchange for both sides agreeing not to pursue further legal costs against each other. I told Diane I wasn't interested in a quiet withdrawal. I'd spent 6 years being quiet, 6 years documenting patterns I'd never confronted directly, 6 years protecting a legacy that belonged to my mother's family, while a woman I'd never trusted slowly annexed everything else my father had. I wasn't going to let this end with a face-saving retreat that let Vanessa walk away with her composure intact, ready to tell whatever version of this story made her look sympathetic to the extended family and social circle she'd need to keep functioning in. I wanted the truth on the record. We agreed to a settlement eventually, but on terms I dictated rather than terms designed to protect Vanessa's reputation. She withdrew her claim entirely, in a formal filing that explicitly acknowledged the trust as my sole, separate property with no connection to my father's estate. She agreed to reimburse a substantial portion of my legal costs, given the evidence that her claim had been pursued, with prior knowledge that directly contradicted her stated basis for filing it. And perhaps most importantly to me, the settlement included no confidentiality provision preventing me from discussing what had happened, a detail Preston Marsh fought hard against and eventually lost, because Diane made clear I had no intention of accepting silence as part of any resolution. The life estate arrangement for the house remained unchanged, per my father's actual will, a decision I could have contested given everything we'd uncovered about Vanessa's conduct, but chose not to, because that arrangement had been my father's genuine wish, expressed clearly and repeatedly in conversations I'd recorded specifically to protect his actual intentions. I wasn't interested in punishing Vanessa beyond what the trust dispute required. I was interested in the truth being established and my mother's legacy being protected, and once both of those things were accomplished, I let the rest go. Vanessa still lives in my father's house, under the terms of the life estate my father genuinely wanted for her. We don't speak beyond the occasional, necessary, logistical communication required by that arrangement. I don't wish her active harm. I simply no longer extend her the benefit of the doubt I spent 6 years extending, against my own better judgment. I think about Gerald Voss sometimes, a man I never met whose own children spent a probate case a decade ago trying to say out loud what I eventually proved in a conference room downtown, that they'd watched the same pattern with the same patients, ending the same way. Nobody believed them enough to act on it. I got lucky in the end, only because I'd spent 6 years quietly documenting instead of quietly hoping. I was wrong. The trust itself now, grown to just over $54 million, remains exactly what my grandfather intended it to be: protected, independently managed, entirely separate from any family dynamic that might try to lay claim to it in the future. I've since restructured parts of it into a foundation focused on ovarian cancer research, funded in my mother's name, a decision that felt like the truest possible use of money my grandfather had, specifically protected. For a daughter, he wanted safe, not just supported. I think sometimes about that conversation in my grandfather's study, 18 months before he died. Your mother would want you protected, not supported, protected. I understand now, in a way I didn't at 26, exactly what he meant. Support is something people give you when they trust your judgment. Protection is something you need when you can see clearly that not everyone around you deserves that trust. I still have that sparrow pin. I wore it to the deposition, actually. Pinned inside my jacket where nobody could see it, not for luck. Exactly, more like I wanted some small piece of my mother in the room the day everything I protected in her name finally got said out loud in front of witnesses, on the record, where it couldn't be quietly buried the way so much of our families. Grief had been buried for years. I don't know if she'd have been proud of how long I stayed quiet, or relieved that I finally stopped. Maybe both. I think grief lets you hold two true things at once more easily than people expect. Vanessa spent 6 years patiently building a version of our family where she controlled the resources, the narrative, and the access. She was extraordinarily good at it, for exactly as long as nobody was watching closely enough to see the pattern underneath the performance. I was watching the entire time. I just never told her. She'd found out eventually, in the worst possible way, through a lawyer's letter, a deposition transcript, and a settlement that stripped away 6 years of careful composure in a conference room downtown. She spent 6 years trying to inherit a family that was never fully hers to claim. It took one hidden trust, protected quietly for over a decade, to show her exactly how much she'd never actually controlled it all.